Hey there and welcome to Concierge Medicine Radio, your source for actionable advice and real stories of physicians running and growing concierge practices. For more interviews and notes on today's show, please visit conciergemedicineradio.com and enter your email. Now, let's join your host, Taylor Pearson.
Hey there guys, welcome back to another episode of Concierge Medicine Radio. Good show today with Dr. Tom Lagrelius. Dr. Lagrelius is a family physician based out of Torrance, California, near Los Angeles. So Tom and I dive into some of the fundamentals and background of concierge medicine based on Tom's 10 years in practice as a concierge doctor at his practice, Skypark Preferred Family Care. So he's been around the block a time or two, and we go back to cover some of the keys to evaluating patient demographics to make sure a practice will successfully convert to a concierge model, the exact process Dr. Lagrelius has used with other physicians to transition, and also an interesting opportunity to start a concierge practice from scratch by moving to an underserved area and what qualifies as an underserved area. So without any further ado, let's get into the interview. Why don't you start and tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice? How did you transition into concierge, and what does your practice look like now?
Well, first of all, I always wanted to be a primary care physician, believe it or not, since I was 5 years old. That's when I decided to do what I do now. Back in those days, all physicians were like concierge doctors. They had small practices, had direct relationships with their patients. There were no insurance companies working in primary care, really. If people had insurance, it was major medical for the hospital. They made their own relationships with patients, and they had direct practices. We're just trying to return to the style of practice that existed when I was in my youth. My own personal physician, a guy named Russell Anderson in Seattle, was my role model. I bet he had far less than 1,000 patients. We knew where he was. We knew how to reach him. We knew where he lived. We had his home phone and his pager number. He made house calls. We never waited to see him. We could see him the same day and the next day. And that's why I wanted to have a practice like this. And I've always run my practice that way. But as the insurance system took over healthcare and the revenue from the practice got less and less and less, most doctors ended up having to see, instead of less than 1,000 patients, thousands and thousands of patients in their practice with short appointments and barriers to access that were unacceptable to me. So my practice has always been pretty much outside the insurance care system. I've never done HMO work. I long ago resigned from all the PPOs that were abusive, and I had direct relationship with my patients. But as of about 9 years ago, I decided to actually create a panel of patients that was fixed, 600 maximum. 100 of them are what I call scholarship patients that don't pay anything, and the other 500 are pay an annual fee to be a member of the practice, and they have direct, immediate access to me 24/7, 365, no matter where I am, and I take care of them in the hospital and make sure they have same-day, next-day appointments if they're sick, and half-an-hour visits and 2-hour physicals once a year. And we do what I think is really top-notch healthcare in that environment, which is what everybody deserves.
And you had a very interesting interview you did earlier this year, which we'll link to, and you talked a little bit about the kind of the economics of it, specifically for your practice, that you were able to actually increase your salary while increasing the level of care you were able to give your patients, and still do, as you said, the scholarships for a large portion of your patient population.
Yeah, about 1 out of 6 of my patients are scholarships. As I say, the revenue stream for conventional practices trying to survive on Medicare and private insurance is very, very small per patient encounter. And it costs the average practice $85,000 a year just to bill the insurance, and then they get reduced payments back. So the average current conventional practice doctor is trying to take care of 2,000-3,000 patients. That isn't possible. If you want to do a careful, comprehensive physical exam and wellness plan on each of your patients once a year. You can't have more than about 600 patients because you can't do more than about 3 of those a day and still take care of the sick people and the hospital work and so on. So you have to limit your practice to about 600 patients if you're going to do careful evaluations once a year. And in order to do that, you have to find a revenue stream way beyond what the current insurance industry will pay doctors. And so we charge $2,100 a year with discounts for couples and families. It averages about $1,800, I suppose, for membership in the practice. And that allows us, with that revenue stream, to do the kind of care that doctors, primary care doctors, used to be able to do when they had a direct revenue stream from their patients.
So for physicians that are sold on this model and see the value you're talking about, what are the major hurdles or the biggest challenges to overcome in getting started and growing a concierge practice?
Well, first of all, one of the best, most important ethical considerations is the consideration of abandonment. I wrote the section on concierge medicine for a textbook from Jefferson University a few years ago, and that's probably worth referring to. It's a good section, but I focused a lot on the abandonment issue. When you limit your practice from thousands of patients to a few hundred patients, you have a lot of people who, for one reason or another, aren't going to join. It's critically important to make sure you establish relationships with those patients with new physicians, and that until they have been established with that new physician, you take care of them when they have urgent medical problems, and you help them arrange that transition. That's a very important aspect of transitioning in practice. Otherwise, I mean, there are a lot of other issues that are very important to figure out in terms of setting up a practice like this. There are legal issues. You need excellent legal advice and excellent advice, usually from a consultant. There are a number of very good consultants out there that people can use to help with the transition. The one I used was Special Docs, a consulting company that's focused, its headquarters in Chicago and was founded by Roberta Greenspan. She's helped convert way over 100 practices across the country in many states, and helped me convert mine and several others in my community. Professional advice from someone who really knows the law and the details of arranging a conversion of the practice is very important. It's very important to educate your patients as to what you're trying to do. It's very important to make sure that the patients understand that you're not going to abandon them. You're going to make sure that they get care, whether they join your practice or not. It's very important to understand that even if 2 years later, someone who's never responded to your offer to join the practice suddenly gets sick, you have an obligation, I think, personally and ethically, to take care of those people until you've transitioned into somebody else's hands. There's so many legal and ethical and practical considerations that it's usually wise to get a consultant. So
if you were a physician, you were thinking about making this transition, is the first step then to contact a consultant?
I think that is an early step. I think it's important to make sure that your practice will convert. There are a lot of practices that are heavily dependent on managed care organizations or in certain geographic parts of the country, which are going to be very difficult to transition. So mostly your consultants will do a survey for you, talk to 100 patients or so, look at their demographics, ask questions, and give you some idea of what the probability is you're going to be successful. If you can't depend on converting several hundred people to the practice, then conversion isn't a reasonable option unless you've done some hard work in advance. The hard work in advance is acting like a concierge doctor before you are one. My home phone has always been published in the local directory ever since I started practice in 1975. I have always taken my own call 24/7, 365. Patients were always looked upon me as an accessible doctor. But there was a time when I had too many patients and there were people waiting in the waiting room and I was working 110, 120 hours a week, and my wife thought I was going to die. So I couldn't go on doing that indefinitely. I had to make a change. And in the current environment, that required cutting the practice volume, which required having a membership.
The consultants you know, do they work just with primary care physicians, or are there also consultants that work with specialists?
Oh, no, they'll work with specialists.
Okay.
I actually share a call right now with an internist endocrinologist, who was the second person in my community to convert to Concierge. We have about 7 now, 4 of us in our call group. There are cardiologists who do it, and consultants have helped with those, rheumatologists, endocrinologists, almost any medical subspecialty, GI. Gary Price down in Florida, who's currently the board chair of AAPP and is on our board of ACPP, is a gastroenterologist, for example. And most of the consultants will work with any medical subspecialist. It's harder for surgical subspecialists to do what we do.
Going back to what you said about patient education, I know that plays a big part, educating your existing patients or people that are considering coming into the practice about the value you offer through the concierge model. So how have you gone about educating patients?
Well, beginning about almost a year before the actual date that we converted, throughout the whole year of 2005, I made a point of spending 1 minute, at the end of each office visit with every single patient, telling them what was going to happen on January 1st, 2006. And then I always had a well-trained staff member, or my wife, who was also extremely well-trained, in the office, and I would say, when we're done with this visit, I want you to go to talk to Amy or Patty and spend some time discussing what the plans for the transition of the practice are. And then they would spend whatever time it took, 15 minutes or so, to describe in detail what the practice was going to be like and how it was going to change and the advantages that there would be to them for joining. Also, my consultant, Roberta Greenspan and Special Docs, we had a telephone line that went directly to her that patients could call to get more information after hours if they wanted to discuss it further. And the consultant would spend whatever time it took to discuss with the patient the questions that they may have had. It's very, very important to educate them. It was especially important 10 years ago because at that time, almost no one in the general population knew what this idea was all about. Right now, it's a lot easier to sell for doctors who are transitioning because the patients all know what a concierge practice is. There are television shows about them. I don't know if you've seen that television show called Royal Pains. It's not a great practice model, but at least it's on television. But there's a lot of newspaper articles on concierge medicine, both pro and con. People are aware of it. So it's not as much of an educational step as it used to be, but it's still very important to educate them, and they don't have a clear idea often of exactly how it works, even though they may have heard of it. So it's very important to educate the patients. Once they get educated, they all want to join, or at least many of them do want to join. Some of the problems are you get too many people want to join. I helped another doctor convert his practice recently, and he just opened a few months ago with a full practice, 600 patients, and 100 people on his waiting list, which is now lengthened. So he's having a problem accommodating him, and most of us have waiting lists now.
Well, that's fantastic. And did he do the same kind of model for transitioning his practice as you did? He started a year in advance. He spoke with all the patients individually. Did he do any sort of speaking or seminars or sending out letters?
You know, I'm not completely privy to everything he did. He used the same consultant I did,
okay.
And basically he followed the same general principles. He may have done some other things that I didn't do. I don't really think it's very effective to hold seminars to try to attract patients. You're trying to convert your own patients, and you want a personal relationship with them. You want to discuss it with each one of them directly and individually. I've had good friends who, Marcy Welling, for example, in Long Beach, she used to have evenings with Marcy sessions. She invited all her patients to come and have wine and cheese at her office. And they would sit around 10 or 15 people and talk about the conversion of her practice. This was, again, about 10 years ago. And that worked very well for her.
So what would you say to physicians who, for one reason or another, can't per se convert their practice but are starting from scratch? What would you tell them to do in terms of building up their practice from the ground?
I would find a successful concierge doctor somewhere and join the practice and work very hard on building their own in that setting. It's very difficult to start a concierge practice from scratch when you don't have anyone to convert. Perhaps not impossible. I've heard of people trying to do it. It took them years and years and years, and they went through a lot of negative cash flow for quite a while to make that happen. It's very difficult, straight out of training, to start your own practice. But most of us who are in practice for a long time, I myself included, are now looking for associates. I actually have a headhunter out looking for an associate for me now. I would be happy to talk to experienced primary care doctors who want to join my practice and build a new one here, and I'm in the process of looking. And I think young doctors coming out of training who want to do this kind of practice de novo should seek that avenue. Otherwise, if you come out of training and you want to eventually have a concierge practice, the way to do it is to join every insurance plan out there that allows you to practice independently on your own, at least, and act like a concierge doctor, working 110, 120 hours a week and being available all the time to anybody who wants you and needs you, and making house calls occasionally and taking care of patients in the hospital when they're sick rather than putting them in the hands of a hospitalist, and act like a concierge doctor for about 5 years till you have several thousand patients in your practice who are convinced that you're a great doc and want to stay with you, and then you convert to practice. I helped a couple do that about 5 years ago, and their practice is very successful. They came out of training together about 5 years ago, a husband and wife team that came to me and asked, how do we do what you do? They set up a conventional practice and acted like concierge doctors for 5 years, built up a practice of several thousand patients, then converted, and their concierge practice is successful. But you have to act like a concierge doctor if you want to become one.
So are most of the concierge physicians you know then actively growing their practices? You said you had a waiting list already and you were seeking someone else to come in and work with you in your practice so you could expand. Is that typical, or do most physicians get to the point where they have 500 or 600 patients and cap it off?
You know, I would say that of the concierge doctors that I'm acquainted with, probably 50% are full with waiting lists and the other 50% are not. The ones that are full with waiting lists, perhaps half of them would love to have an associate join them and help the new associate build the practice. And since there are probably about 10,000 concierge doctors out there right now, if I had to guess, there's probably 2,500 of them out there who could take in a new associate. That would be a guess, random guess. I might be off by 100%. You know, it could be 1,500 or 1,000, but that's a guess.
What do you attribute to the continued growth of your practice? What's the number one thing that attracts new patients to your practice?
Word of mouth. The new patients that come to my practice almost all come because some other patient recommended them. I get a few referrals from specialists in the community that I work with who want their patients to have optimal primary care and send them to me. I occasionally get a patient from a website referral who's seen my own website and just calls de novo. I occasionally get a patient from AAPP's website, where they're looking for concierge doctors and they find us there, or the ACPP website. But most of them, I would say 80% of the new patients I get are referred by other patients.
What's the most common mistake you see people either thinking about or making the transition to concierge or direct pay medicine make?
The most common mistake I see made is not getting a good consultant.
And
That is critical.
how would you recommend someone get a good consultant as opposed to just a consultant?
Well, the two best known ones, of course, are MDVIP and special docs. There's a lot of other consultants that I'd rather not get into listing all of those. Those are the two I really have great respect for. And there are others that are very good too, but I'd rather not get into that right now. I think next to not getting an excellent consultant who really knows how to start and organize concierge practices, the next biggest mistake people make, in my view, are trying to run a hybrid practice. More of those fail than any other kind of attempt. People who are trying to straddle the fence and continue operating their traditional practice while providing concierge services for a small number of people, like 50 patients who pay an extra fee, this is, to my mind, very counterproductive. First of all, you can't cut your workload down at all and do a good job for the 50 you've enrolled. Secondly, most of the patients don't want to switch because they can stay with you anyway without paying the annual fee, so they don't switch. More of these practices fail than the kind where you make a total conversion. So the second mistake, I think most common mistake, that people make is attempting to run a hybrid practice which mixes conventional practice with concierge practice. Now, there have been some successes at it, particularly people who take their concierge practice to an office next door. It's really separate. They use a physician's assistant or nurse practitioner to run the old conventional practice, and they only see the patients that the nurse practitioner or physician's assistant feels that they have to have the doctor see, and they do that in a limited way, and they really do focus on the new patients. That can work if you can get enough to convert, but in many cases that doesn't work. So a hybrid practice where you're trying to stand on both sides of the fence at once, to me, is a poor idea for most people, although some people have made it work.
If you could say only one thing to physicians then considering moving into concierge practice or in the process of doing so, what's the one piece of advice you would leave them with?
Well, I guess the one piece of advice I would give right away is make sure that your practice is convertible and get a good consultant. I think I've already said that. And make sure that you are practicing concierge medicine or the nearest thing to it before you try to convert, or the patients will see that there's no advantage to the conversion. I guess the other thing to recognize is that they should realize that concierge medicine is not easy work. It's not like you're going to go on a vacation. Yes, you see less patients. Yes, you spend a lot more time with patients and delve into their issues much more deeply. But you're available 24/7, 365, virtually all the time. I tell my patients the only time they can't reach me is when I'm under general anesthesia. And that's literally true. I've been under general anesthesia twice in the last 10 years, and during that 2 hours, they couldn't reach me. Otherwise, my patients have been able to reach me with one 10-digit dial directly anytime. They have my cell phone memorized, and my home phone and my office phone. If they can't reach me with one dial or two dials, they haven't tried very hard. And you need to be available. You have to recognize that you're not going to have to do much after midnight very often, but when it's needed, you must respond.
Kind of gives a real picture of what it actually looks like to run a concierge practice.
Having said that, I think it's been 6 days since my phone rang after midnight. So it's not common that I'm wakened. But if at 4 a.m. somebody wakes me up with a lacerated arm, I meet them at the office and sew it up. I don't send them to the emergency room. So that's what you have to be prepared for.
But in your experience, patients don't abuse that privilege.
No, they don't. In fact, my complaint to my patients is they don't call me when they should. They go and do something foolish. I can't tell you how many times somebody's shown up in my office on a Monday morning with a badly closed laceration after having poured peroxide on it at home, which you should never do, and doing something foolish instead of calling me. I can't tell you how many times people have landed in the emergency room with relatively minor problems that should not have gone to the emergency room, and then sat in the emergency room for 6 hours having people with the flu cough on them when they should have called me. And so my big complaint to my patients is they don't call me enough. And I keep emphasizing that to them all the time. If you have a first aid issue at 2 a.m, call me.
Well, are there any tools specifically that you use to manage your practice like that, to keep track of patients? Do you just do phone, email, text message?
I use all those tools, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I use e-prescribing, and I keep track of all the prescriptions my patients get. All my patients' records are on electronic files, but I use paper charts too, because I hate having electronic stuff in the room with the patient. I want to be talking to them with a paper and pencil, so I have paper charts, but I put everything on electronics also. I have a lot of staff. I have 4 people in the office all the time. We have gourmet coffee and fresh baked chocolate chip cookies, and they're only allowed to have chocolate chip cookies in the office, by the way. They're not allowed to have them at home.
Oh, that's a dangerous precedent to set.
And it's a very, very comfortable home-like environment. We don't have a wall between the non-waiting room and the front desk. It's just open. Big desk out there where my receptionist sits, and welcomes people. And if they have a 10 o'clock appointment, we see them at 10 or 10:05. They don't have to wait. It's a very warm, receptive environment in this office.
Dr. Lagrelius, thank you very much for your time. If someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
310-378-6208.
All right.
Day, that's where I am. That's my office number. At night, that number forwards to my cell phone. Keep in mind, I'm on the West Coast. When you call me on the East Coast at 9 a.m., it wakes me up at 6.
All right. Well, we will put your phone number, and we'll also put a link to your website up on the show notes for this episode. And if people want to get in touch with you, they can do it there.
Thanks for joining us today at Concierge Medicine Radio. If you found today's show valuable, we'd love it if you spread the word by leaving us a review on iTunes or sharing it with your friends. To see notes on today's show, please visit us at conciergemedicineradio.com. While you're there, leave us your email to hear about all upcoming episodes.